I love nonlinear narratives. Sorry, that joke won't make sense to most of you. But yeah, nonlinear narratives. Instead of normal stories where events occur one after another in a timeline, nonlinear narratives have a whole nother dimension they add to the story. Say you have a narrative that branches. Now you're not just telling one story, you're presenting a whole possibility space of different things that could happen and different ways this story could go down. But branching narratives are far from the only way to do this. And so in this video, I want to look at 5 different ways that you can tell stories non-linearly, what the advantages of those techniques are, what stories and mediums take the most advantage of them, and what kinds of stories can you only tell by using these less direct means. And at the end, we're going to look at a video game that uses all 5 of these techniques together to create an experience that's one of my favorite I've ever had consuming media.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
Okay, so starting with branching narratives, the idea here is that there's multiple options within a story. These days, people mainly associate this with dialogue trees in video games, but there's lots of other ways people have done this. Old text-based adventure games had you typing text into a command prompt until some command got recognized and it moved the story forward. The movie Clue had multiple versions that released, and so you had to go to different theaters to get different endings.
Would anyone care for fruit or dessert?
I'm gonna go home and sleep with my wife.
And the Choose Your Own Adventure kids books had you jump to different page numbers based on the decisions you want to make. But regardless of the technique you use, all branching narratives have the same fundamental problem: exponential growth. Let's say you have 10 pages of script and then a binary choice. Go left or right, shoot the gun or don't, that kind of thing. Then for each of those options, you write another 10 pages of script and then have a new choice at the end of those. Now we have 4 paths, and each additional choice we have will double the total amount of endings the story has. This builds up exponentially. So with only 10 choices, and again 10 pages between each choice, we end up with 1,024 different endings, each one of which takes 110 pages to reach. But the total number of pages in this book has to be way higher than 110. In this setup, it works out to 20,470 pages. That's 200 times more work than you would need to for a linear story. And even if they go through it multiple times to get different endings, unless they're going through it 200 times, it's not worth it. And this will get worse if you decide to do more than 10 pages in between each gap, or offer more than 2 possible options at each choice. Plus, the medium you're telling this story in is going to matter for how problematic this inefficiency is. Just adding some more text isn't that expensive, but if you have to add some new art or music, or do a whole new animated scene, or film an entire live-action scene, this multiplied price becomes a bigger and bigger deal. So how do the Choose Your Own Adventure books, for example, do this? Well, here's a graph of how the story structure of one of these books works. To start with, between each choice, there's usually only 1 page of writing, and often it's just a couple paragraphs. But beyond that, there's a number of techniques they and other branching narratives use to quote-unquote prune this tree of options and make it more economical to produce. One option is what I call fake choices. They give you what looks like a branch, but both paths actually end up going to the same place. Take this branch in the narrative from Dispatch, which for brevity will speed up a little.
Documentation, one of the 3 Ds at SDN. There tends to be a healthy amount of paperwork. I used to call it triple Ds, but I was informed that had a different connotation.
3 Ds?
Dispatching, documentation, diversity is the 3rd, not in terms of priority, of course. Yep, we're all about diversity. Documentation, one of the 3 Ds at SDN. There tends to be a healthy amount of paperwork. I used to call it triple Ds, but I was informed that had a different connotation.
What kind of heroes end up here?
Oh, all sorts. Some that are tired of doing it themselves, some heroes who prefer teams.
And some that used to be called Invisibitch. Quite the eclectic roster.
Yep, we're all about diversity. Documentation, one of the 3 Ds at SDN. There tends to be a healthy amount of paperwork. I used to call it triple Ds, but I was informed that had a different connotation.
How many heroes do you have here?
Network-wide, we're over 300. Here at the Torrance branch, we've got somewhere between 45 and 50, depending on our roster at any given time, working different shifts. Yep, we're all about diversity.
So you can see, after splitting, the narrative collapses back into one single route. And if you map out the choices for full episode of Dispatch, it looks something like this, where nearly every decision branches and then collapses back like this. So the whole episode looks linear, even though we have a bunch of these choice options. You'll also notice in the choose your own adventure diagram that different paths have different total lengths. And that's because some of those paths will end the story early by you completing your goal or having your prospective character die or something like that. The visual novel Fate Stay Night does this with a bunch of their choices, where there's the correct one that advances the story and an incorrect one that causes the story to end early. For example, really early on, you can choose to reject the call to adventure and just skip out on the whole magic battle that's about to start. Now, at this point, it's maybe worth pausing and thinking for yourself whether these false choices and sudden ends to the story really add much versus telling the story linearly, like a TV show or a book. Although, regardless of how you answer that, a lot of these are using digital media still to do stuff you couldn't do otherwise, like have voice acting and soundtracks, which I do think add a fair bit. Sorry, I'm a nerd. So we've seen the difficulties of branching narratives, but what are the advantages? Like, why go through all that effort to structure your story like this? The maybe most obvious here is role-playing. Instead of writing your main character, you can let your audience choose the actions of said character. They can act the way they want to in the moment and experience the story that way. This has a big advantage for immersion. You're making these decisions and really getting in the world, but also I think adds some ownership. Like, you care more about the results of an action if you were the one who took that action. And this kind of creates some tension, where the more you want your audience to put themselves in a role, the less that role has to exist already. So the result is you get this kind of spectrum of main characters in this kind of story, where on one hand, you have characters with basically no characterization. The player/consumer of your story is the one who decides entirely what this character is like. And on the other end, we have full characters in their own right that the writer has determined, that the player is then just kind of shaping the direction of the story. And this is a thing writers have to choose. Do you want to lean more towards having character autonomy and the ability to insert yourself into that role? Or do you want to lead more towards having a real fleshed out character that you can incorporate into your story in a predictable way? Another advantage to branching narratives is a feeling of exploration. You don't just get one story, you can see what would happen if you had chosen other things. This can add stakes to your story in a way that's otherwise kind of difficult to do. You know for sure that this series of actions is the only way to save the world because you have experienced not doing these actions and the world ending. And there's lots of games that deal with consequences being more significant in branching narratives like this. You're kind of complicit to the events of a story in a way you're not in a traditional linear narrative. There's even an extent you can apply this to any interactive medium, even if it's not branching. Like in a movie, a scary thing will just happen. But in a video game, you have to actively choose to go towards the scary thing. Prey is a great example of this, which if you haven't played already, I'm going to spoil the first 5 minutes, which is super cool. But there's this whole sequence where you're trapped in an apartment and can't get out until you think to grab a wrench and smash your window. In doing so, realizing that your apartment wasn't real and you're in a lab being experimented on instead. There's only one way to advance the story here, but it doesn't happen until you have the idea to do it, which I think is meaningfully different from just watching a show where the main character does this. And in a similar way, I actually think those quote-unquote meaningless choices and dead ends I talked about earlier do matter. There's a great talk that Tom Francis did at last year's GDC about narratives in his game Tactical Breach Wizards. This game has a ton of these branching dialogue options, and they never really do anything, they're just kind of there to shove some jokes in. But nonetheless, he talks about how crazy valuable these were to his writing process. For jokes, the multiple options essentially give you 3 tries to make someone laugh. And not only do you get 3 chances to make them laugh, players only tend to remember the one they like most. So you're basically live A/B testing different styles of comedy for the player in the moment. In more serious moments, it also lets the player control the vibe of the story. You can have a dialogue tree where one of the options is stay silent as the protagonist, and one of the options is crack a joke. Not only does this let the player tune how serious they want the story to feel, for the player who wants the serious story, they still read that joke, even though it canonically doesn't happen. So you're able to both tell the joke while also canonically not having a jokey character. And that's something you just can't do in a linear narrative. This is my answer to why those pointless options we saw in the game Dispatch make it a better experience. Take literally the first lines in the game.
Obviously, I love him. He's my dad. What does that mean? Just say what you want to say.
It's just, when you add obviously, it feels a little less obvious. So, I'll ask again. How do you really feel about your father?
Again, this is literally the opening to the game. So you obviously have no idea who this guy is, who his father is, or what their relationship actually was. So you can't answer in a role-playing way, and you don't really even know enough to explore options. The only thing you have to go off of is your preferences in stories. Do you want this to be the type of story where the main character shits on his dad, or the type of story where he looks up to his dad? That's not going to change the capital P plot of the story, but each of those options will appeal more to different people. It means from the get-go, you're tuning the tone of the story into one you like more. And like, honestly, as a writer, I would love to have this ability in something like a YouTube video. Like, are you annoyed that I've been spending this long on the first topic when I've said we're going to get to 5 topics eventually? Are you already familiar with everything I've talked about and I should skip to my most novel points? If I use the expression Sweetsian game, do you know what I'm talking about? Is this list of examples too long and you wish it were shorter? All those would be great if I could design 2 separate versions of this video that would fit you better depending on your answers. And actually, let's give this a test. So if you're interested in me more ramblingly going through a bunch of examples one by one for all 5 types of narratives, I want you to press the L key on your keyboard or double tap right on mobile when this circle lights up. Whereas if you want me to cut to the chase and just say my most original ideas right away, don't touch anything. If you're on some other platform, you're just going to have to watch both options of this dialogue tree because it's not that advanced. But anyways, 1, 2, 3, now. You didn't hit the button and therefore don't want to hear more? Fair enough, I'd recommend pausing the video and clicking the Recursive Meta-Narrative timestamp in the description. Otherwise, you're about to hear the other side of the dialogue tree. You hit the button and therefore want to hear me ramble a bit more. Awesome. With that, let's move on to our next type of nonlinear narrative. Looping narratives. The idea here is you go through a story once and then come back and go through a story a second time, but on that second time, something's different. And to kind of understand the whole story, you need to do that repetition of it. One common way of doing this is having scenes that are a little odd the first watch through, but going through a second time take on a new meaning. You might have a character say something like, "Isn't it weird we call them Arabic numerals, but in Arabic they don't use those. They use a different set of numerals that look similar but are different." And the first time you watch that, you're like, okay, this guy's just saying a random thing. But maybe on a second watch through, you're like, oh, that was actually a clue that makes sense with the thing that came later. This shows up all over. In fantasy books, it's often prophetic dreams, and in science fiction books, it's often some time travel element. I don't know what Dune is. Both, I guess. But this is similar to a branching narrative, where you're writing 2 versions of the same scene for different readers. But here you're layering them on top of each other. There's the one reader who's going through it the first time, and another reader who's going through it a second time. And so you have to write it in a way that it makes sense for the person going through the first time, but also in a way that it is different for the person going through the second time. Now, this isn't easy to do by any means, but one of the big advantages is that it can make your story feel more cohesive. If you have a bunch of twists that are going to happen later in the story, by kind of foreshadowing them indirectly like this, it can feel surprising on a first watch, but feel cohesive on a second watch. When Attack on Titan was coming out, I rewatched the entire show after every season finished airing. And each time I did that, there were moments throughout the show that felt different. Some scenes took on a different meaning after I finished the first season.
I'm sorry,
I was paying attention to different characters after finishing season 2. Rewatching after season 3, I understood the world better than even the characters did.
Who do you think the real enemy is here?
And after finishing the whole show, you get a new perspective on the themes and structures that the story has had from the beginning. To me, this made the show so much more fun to watch, but it's kind of unfortunate that I don't think anyone's gonna do this anymore. Now that the whole show is out, when you reach a cliffhanger at the end of a season, you're just gonna watch the next episode. You're not gonna pause and rewatch the entire show up until that point to better predict what's gonna happen next. And this is where I think games have a more unique relationship to looping narratives. Games definitionally have to let you fail, so your story needs to account for the possibility that the player's gonna lose. Most of the time, this is done by just restarting the section you failed at. The kind of implicit assumption here is that if your character dies, it was not canon to the story, and we're going to restart until we get the real thing that happened. You could conceptually write a narrative that branches every time there's a possibility of failure, but as we talked about, that's going to get exponentially more expensive the longer your game is. So the best way to do this is to have the game loop, but have that looping be incorporated into the story. Many games do this by explicitly having a time loop be an element of the plot, but lots of others just have structures that handle repetition well, and have the story still make sense even if you lose repeatedly. It's also possible to use the same story, but come at it from a new perspective when you loop it. A great example of this is Fire Emblem Three Houses, which has 3 different routes that split right at the beginning of the game. Each of these has a different plot that you go throughout the game, but to save money, and because it fits the 4-act structure, the events that occur in the first half of the game are the same no matter what you pick, and they don't diverge until a big climactic thing happens midway through. So when you want to loop through the game and go through a different route, you're going to have to go through the same opening events for half the game. There is a little bit of the dual writing, hidden meaning stuff we've talked about, but mainly they keep it fresh by having your cast of characters be largely different. An early event that happens in all 3 routes is a noble lord starting a rebellion against the church. This occurs the same in all 3 routes, but there's a different perspective on it. One route focuses on character drama, and so the focus of the rebellion in this route is that the leader is the adopted father of a kid you know.
We shouldn't have killed them. We should have found another way.
In another route, you're focusing more on the injustices of the system and the cruelty of the church in response to this rebellion.
Even if our enemies are the gods themselves, we must never lose sight of our goal.
While the third route focuses more on the underlying lore and mysteries, and so there's more emphasis placed on why that rebellion happened in the first place and what's going on behind the scenes.
Why would Lord Lonato incite such a reckless rebellion? He had to have known he had no chance of winning.
Between all 3, it's the same plot point and the same mechanical mission, but because you have different characters in each route, the side conversations, and therefore the lens you're viewing these events from, is different. And so looping through the story like this gives you a broader understanding of the world and what's going on than you could have from a single playthrough. Okay, now this next section is about meta-narratives, but that's a term that's used a bunch of different ways. So to be specific, I'm talking about a narrative that then you have a game of discovering that narrative, and that game forms a secondary narrative. So it's a story about the discovery of a story. That's a concise way of putting it, but to really explain what I mean by that and why I think it's interesting, we're going to need to be on the same page for 3 bits of theory. First, how to convert a game into a story, then how to convert a story into a game, and finally, the concepts of fabula and sujet. So the first one is pretty easy. When you play a game, you are, in necessity, acting out a story. All games involve some challenge that you are trying to overcome that you ultimately succeed or fail at. There are plenty of stories of people just playing sports, board games, or video games, sometimes with added context of what's going on in those characters' lives to make that game important, but sometimes not. Sometimes the competition itself is all the conflict you need.
Yes! 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 Oh my god!
Now, the problem comes with trying to integrate these emergent stories you get from playing games with traditional narratives, because while you might know whether the player won or lost, you don't necessarily know how they did it. The narrative implications of a character finally defeating their enemy after 3,000 attempts is very different than the narrative implications of them giving up and having a friend show up and do it for them. So treating games as stories is kind of difficult in the larger context of a story you're trying to tell. But what about treating stories as games? What do I mean by that? Well, I think this is easiest to see in mysteries. The story implies the goal of you solving the mystery. There are clues of varying levels of details that'll help point you along that path. And you're not supposed to use any meta information you have, like the length of the season, to help you out here. Obviously, you don't have to approach mysteries like this. You can just look up the answers online to what's going to happen. So it requires a certain mindset that you're trying to solve the mystery. If you're familiar with the Sweetsian definition of games, or saw my Minecraft video, this should be recognizable as being a game. Like I said, I think this is most obvious with mysteries, but you can approach any story like this, whether it be who's going to win in a series of fights coming up, or predicting how a character will respond emotionally to the events that just occurred. And while I realize this is a weird way to approach it, I genuinely think this is part of why stories can help you build empathy and understand other people better. There's also more ways to approach this than just predicting things. You have stuff like Socratic philosophy books, which instead of a normal philosophy book that just tells you some ideas, have this narrative framing of a master teaching some students. Usually the master will ask some question, and then the students will respond. But the best way to consume these is to pause reading when the master asks a question, think about it for yourself, and then continue. If the student had the same answer as you, then the master's retort to that student is a retort to your thinking. And if not, you've gotten a new perspective on how to see the philosophy. You can even use this same framework to think about abstract art in media. Your goal is to figure out what something means, and the restriction is you can't just have the author tell you or look up what someone else thinks it means. You have to engage with the media or art yourself and come to your own conclusions.
Was this all in my mind? What's an Ava? Is that sort of a Freudian thing, or am I real?
The act of finding meaning in art is more important than the meaning itself is, I think, analogous, or the same thing, as the statement, the act of playing basketball is more important than the final goal of getting the balls through hoops. I realize I, as a game developer, saying that everything is a game is one of those if all you have is a hammer kind of situations. But the point I'm getting at here is that actively consuming media can be thought of as a game. But the problem is, as a writer, you don't know what that game is going to be, or if your audience is even playing it. You don't know if they're actively trying to predict what's going to happen next, empathize with your characters, or try to understand the deeper meaning of the metaphors you're showing. You may recall me asking you to pause and think for yourself earlier in this video. Now, at this point, it's maybe worth pausing and thinking for yourself. I don't know if you did that, which is why it's difficult to count on this kind of thing when you're developing a story. And this is somewhat of a mirror to our previous statement. Stories create games, but you don't know what type of game and whether the audience is actually playing it. And games create stories, but you don't know what kind of story and what the payoff to it is. With both of those in mind, we can get to the point I've been building all of this towards, which is that video games are uniquely positioned to synthesize both of these ideas, covering their weaknesses and building on their strengths. And you can do this pretty simply, but explaining how requires that final bit of theory, fabula and sujet, where fabula is the actual chronological sequence of events that happen in the world, and sujet is the sequence of events as they're presented to the viewer. So, like the beginning of the movie Oppenheimer has 3 scenes in this order. We have Oppenheimer being interviewed in a security hearing, Strauss in the future talking about that security hearing, and then when Oppenheimer talks about his past, we flash back to that. So the actual order of events, the fabula, is like this. Oppenheimer in college, then Oppenheimer in the security meeting, then Strauss later talking about it. But for reasons of dramatic tension, the movie doesn't tell you these events in this order. They scramble them up in order to make it more dramatic. This new order is called the sujet. There's a large backlog of stories that have this scrambled sujet like this for different reasons and with different levels of complexity. Of these examples, Mementos is extra weird because half of the movie is taking place in chronological order, but then it cuts to these black and white segments, which are taking place in reverse chronological order, and then the end of the movie is when those 2 timelines meet and match up, which is just to say that it can get very complicated, but doesn't have to be. A basic flashback would also be counted in this. And actually, my favorite example is from the show Bakano. It opens with the scene that, chronologically, takes place at the end of the story. 2 characters, the vice president of a newspaper and his assistant, are debating the best way to tell the story to their readers. They go back and forth debating where on the timeline would be best to start telling the story, and what character would make the most sense to follow. This then results in one of my favorite episode title drops in any show I've ever seen.
It wouldn't be too surprising for you and I to be the people, or the characters who begin this tale.
Really?
Like, man, I don't know about you. This is so cool. This is such a cool way to introduce a show. Oh, it got me so hooked. Anyways. But significantly for what we're talking about here, the vice president of the newspaper is not the main character of the show. He basically doesn't show up after the pilot. It exemplifies that when the sujet is so scrambled like this, the person going through the story doesn't really have to have anything to do with it. So much so you can split it into 2 different stories. There's the underlying story of what happened, and then the story in the present of someone going through and discovering that story. And this is how you get that synthesis of games and stories that I talked about earlier. Your pre-authored story story can be the fabula, the underlying contents of the plot. But then you can have a totally separate story of a character going through discovering that story. The fabula can be presented as a bunch of fragments that are difficult to piece together, and you as the author don't even necessarily know the order in which they're going to discover these things. But no matter how scrambled that sujet gets, the underlying fabula will remain the same. So you can write stories that won't be interfered by whatever action the player takes. And you know how the player is going to interact with the story because it's presented as a game from the get-go. So you can do stuff like gating content behind solving some element of the mystery. You could only be in this location if you figured something out, so we can time a reveal given that you know that information now. You don't have to spell everything out to get everyone on the same page like you would need to in a linear story. And you can commit to this as much as you want. Some games, this is the whole point, discovering the plot of what happened. But in other games, it's presented as a side thing you can optionally do, which lets players who want to engage with the lore have this mystery of figuring it out, but players who don't can just skip right past it. It's not in your face like a normal story cutscene would be. There's a whole bunch of advantages to this structure. But yeah, that's what I mean by meta-narrative. You have this underlying narrative that's split up into a bunch of chunks, a game of assembling those chunks together, and then finally a narrative over top of that of how you assembled those. The top-level narrative being the sujet of the bottom-level fabula. This being nonlinear because there's a number of different ways you can reassemble that sujet that the author doesn't necessarily know. Because it's a game, you don't know what clues the player is going to pick up on and what they're not. But this disjointed structure means that no matter what happens, you still get a cohesive story at the end, and you get all the benefits of it being a game and the player engaged with trying to predict it. Cool. This next part is going to not make sense to you probably because in the branching narrative section, I tell people that they can click ahead to this timestamp that's about to show up. So I'm going to be talking to the people who did that, whereas you who have faithfully watched through the video in a linear manner can mostly ignore it. Yeah. Continue. Oh, well, look at this guy, clicking timestamps, trying to jump forward and skip stuff. Do you ever think maybe there's a reason I laid out the video in the order that I did? Maybe I, having spent months working on this, have thought about it more than you, who spent 20 minutes watching it? Less, because you're skipping around? Probably watching this dumb thing on ×2 speed on your second monitor. Ugh. You know what? I care. I have respect for people who spend a lot of time thinking about how they structure their stories. I'm down here making stuff and building an appreciation for the art. So you know what? All right, we're going to do the same thing again. I'm going to have this light that's going to turn on. It's going to count down. And then when it hits 0, I want you to hit the 0 key on your keyboard, all right? I really like when people put a lot of time and care into the narratives. Because, unlike you, okay, you were supposed to hit the 0 key right when I finished that word. If you don't know, the 0 key restarts the video. So you can try that to see what I'm going for there. With that out of the way, we're talking about recursive meta-narratives next. This is a derivative of the previous section's idea, so hopefully you watch that. But here we go. A cool pairing with this meta-narrative idea is opening with a character that has amnesia. This shows up in a bunch of different stories where the main character starts in a blank room and doesn't know who they are or how they got there. The answers to those questions are usually flashbacks. So we get the kind of meta-narrative structure of a past story that's being revealed in some disjointed manner, and then the present story of revealing it. And this actually solves a dilemma we talked about earlier with role-playing characters, where a pre-authored character doesn't leave room for the player to interpret it how they want, but a fully player-authored character is hard to write into your script. By having your player character have amnesia, they can both have the freedom to act however they want, and be able to be an important character in the story. In the first Witcher game, Geralt can be a big character in the plot with a lot of backstory, but because he has amnesia, you can roleplay as him even if you don't know any of that backstory. There's a narrative reason for him to be acting differently than he normally would. Having your perspective character involved like this, both in the past story and the current story of discovering that past, creates a different dynamic than the perspective character being unrelated to past events. And that's because at this top layer of decisions, there's someone other than you who cares about the results. The Tarnished in Elden Ring only cares about the lore if you, the player, do, but a main character with amnesia very much cares about what happened in the past, which encourages you, the player, to be interested in those events as well. You are explicitly role-playing a character who wants to learn about the story, because that story is directly about them. So we get this bottom layer of lore that is then mixed up into a new sujet by the player, but because you're role-playing a character in that story, the act of you piecing it together is, in and of itself, itself another story, the story of uncovering the mystery. And you may recall from the previous theory section that all stories can be turned into games, and that's where we're starting to get this recursive idea, treating that end result as a linear story that then can be analyzed as a game and then have a story on that, etc. I realized we ventured into hard theory land, so to make it more clear what exactly I'm talking about and why you'd want to do that, let's look at some examples. Petscop is a series of videos here on YouTube. The videos are of a guy named Paul playing a video game named Petscop. That right there is a meta-narrative, the story of Paul uncovering the story of Petscop. But those YouTube videos have mysteries in them. It seems like Paul was somehow involved with the creation of Petscop, and there's a bunch of things that are mysteriously censored or otherwise altered in the videos. The video series ends without ever fully spelling out what was going on, and so there's a game of trying to figure out what was happening there. If you want to know what was going on, you can look up a video on Petscop's lore, but there's nothing definitive, so these are just the story of someone attempting to piece together the lore. So an analysis of Petscop is the story of someone trying to solve the mystery of Petscop, the video series, which is, in and of itself, the story of Paul solving the game of piecing together the underlying story of Petscop. Right, why would you make it that convoluted? Let's try to go through this layer by layer. Petscop, the video game, doesn't actually exist, but assuming it did, it would be almost impossible to solve its underlying mysteries. First of all, it seems like an unassuming indie game. If I just found this on itch, I would spend 5 minutes playing it and then say, there's nothing else going on here, and turn it off. So having the character of Paul start the video by saying, hey, look, I found some weird stuff, there's more to this game than I first thought, gets us past that first hurdle of people not even engaging with the mystery to start with. In the same way that having a character you're role-playing as that's interested in the lore will get you to investigate it more. Having Paul also lets the author do things that you couldn't expect a normal player of the game to do. For example, Paul tries weird things like leaving the game running idle for multiple hours at a time. If this was the only way to get a certain clue, you couldn't expect most people to try this. The context of Paul trying to solve the mystery also makes it extra noticeable when Paul ignores things that feel like obvious clues.
This is backwards. It says, do you remember being born? Moving on.
And this tees up the secondary game of you solving the mystery that Paul isn't. The fact that the base layer of the narrative is someone trying to solve a mystery game tees up the viewer to try approaching this series of videos as a mystery itself. Like a murder mystery is obviously something from the get-go you know you should be trying to solve. But at least at the start, Petscop isn't obviously a mystery like that. The fact that it's not just some guy doing a let's play of a video game is a twist that you have to figure out. But the context of the main character saying there's more going on here primes you to analyze things more deeply than you would otherwise. The video game Inscription has a similarly nested narrative like this, with the difference that Inscription is a real video game. So at a basic level, it is a game, but then there's a narrative element that makes you look at the game differently and approach it as a meta-narrative game about solving a mystery. In that mystery game, you are role-playing as a guy named Luke, which lets them have Luke take actions that you, the player, might not. Then at a final level, there's some unsolved stuff that Luke never figures out, which tees up a broader mystery game layer on top of it that you solve in an ARG. This final level is something you don't have in Petscop because some people are going to be playing Inscription just as a roguelike deck builder and might not want to engage with the lore. So having the lore as a mystery game lets the players that want to engage with it do so, and the players who don't can ignore it. Broadly, the idea of these recursive meta-narratives is that you have linear story elements that then become non-linear based on how the player interacts with them, but you linearize it after the fact with another narrative layer, repeating this as many times as you want for different effects. The two examples we showed become non-linear by doing some meta-narrative detective story style things. But some of the coolest untapped potential here is turning a story into a game that isn't a detective game. You may recall me waxing philosophical about using this for philosophy or abstract art. I really think there's some cool stuff that could be done by combining this recursive meta-narrative idea with that. The only example that I know that really gets close to this is the game The Beginner's Guide, where you're playing a series of video games, but there's a narrator that's talking through his interpretation of those video games.
What was going through his head as he was building this? This is what I like about all of Coda's games. I mean, not that they're all fascinating as games, but that they are all going to give us access to their creator.
So there's the base level of the actual game, which then becomes nonlinear because the author doesn't know how you're going to interpret what that game means. But then they have another guy interpreting the game alongside you. This acts similar to the characters prompting you by saying, hey, there's more going on here. But in this case, he's prompting you by saying, hey, this means something. Then at a higher level, there's a number of things that the narrator does that make it obvious he's interpreting the art wrong, or at the very least, encouraging you to interact with it in a way that the author didn't intend.
Apparently, this space station has a labyrinth on it. Sure, I don't know. There's really no reason for it that I've ever been able to discern, so in the interest of time, I'm just gonna skip you on past it. Or, if you'd really like to solve the labyrinth, you're welcome to do that too.
Now, this is a very intentionally weird and avant-garde kind of game, so I don't even know if my interpretation of it is necessarily correct. But at the very least, I think this nested, higher-level narrative of someone along with you interpreting the art gets you to interpret both that underlying art and the beginner's guide as a whole in a much more critical light. And while the beginner's guide doesn't do this, I think there's some potential here to force the user to engage with things. Similar to gating content in detective games behind you solving some level of the mystery, you could potentially gate some content in an art game around certain interpretations of the art. Again, I don't know of anything that does this. The closest is maybe the fictional video game in the story The Three-Body Problem, but it's the type of thing that feels uniquely possible with interactive media. And I really hope this kind of game gets explored more and doesn't just end up as some footnote in what's possible. Okay, the final nonlinear narrative technique I want to talk about is combinatorial narratives. Here, instead of just writing a single story, the author writes a bunch of chunks of story, and then can later tell a story by shuffling together those chunks in any order they want. One way of doing this is a pool of random events, where in each playthrough you'll get some number of them. If done well, it'll make each of those playthroughs feel pretty different. I've actually done a little mock version of this with some videos in the description you can try out. Click 1 through 10 to get a little snippet of a story, and based on the order you combine them, you're going to end up with a different final narrative. Let's say you go through like this. A man feels content. A man makes a lot of money. A man gets in an argument with his father. A man feels depressed. Put in that order, it feels like a story of someone's life falling apart. But if we instead go through in this order, a man feels depressed. A man gets in an argument with his father. A man makes a lot of money. A man feels content. Now, it sounds more like the story of someone getting their life back together, or the story of how money solves this guy's problems with his father, or I don't know, I only kind of wrote this. Anyways, this is kind of a weird writing restriction because you have to write somewhat generically to be able to reorder things like this and have it make sense. And that gets increasingly difficult when you try to do anything bigger than the little toy examples I'm doing here. But when you pull it off, it lets you tell a much wider range of stories than you had to actually write. Unlike in branching narratives, where the amount of writing you had to do grew exponentially for the amount of stories you want to tell. In this, the amount of stories you can tell grows combinatorically with the number of story chunks you write. So in the same way that every time you shuffle a deck of cards, you get a unique order of cards that no one's ever seen before. Every time you go through a combinatoric story, you're getting a sequence of events that's totally unique to that run through. One way to implement this is actually just having a bunch of texts that randomly will show up. You can also do this with game mechanics by having some scripted event happen. Or you can mix the two by having some written story elements that'll interact with some gameplay systems. This type of nonlinear story also shows up a lot in tabletop role-playing games. If a dungeon master doesn't want to improvise an entire scene and make it interesting, they can pre-write a number of events. But by letting the players choose the order in which they engage with those events, they're still allowing some autonomy. They're not railroading people down one single narrative. The Dungeon Master isn't writing the whole story ahead of time, but they're writing the chunks of that story and then piecing them together live into a unique order as it's played. And this is another cool way of turning the story into a game. By letting players choose an order of events, they're shaping the narrative in the way they want to shape it. And this is, I think, meaningfully different from role-playing. You're not choosing what that character would want to do, you're choosing what you think would be a good story. Most of the time, if you're role-playing a character, you're going to have that character try to avoid dying. But if your goal is instead to order events in a way that tells a cool story, you might think it's more interesting if a character dies earlier. And writing stories in this nonlinear, chunk-based way can enable people to make that choice. So I think all these story structures are pretty cool and can do a bunch of fun things and cause you to interact with stories in a different way than you normally would. And this is where I reveal that the entire video has actually been just setting the grounds for me to gush about how cool of a video game Slay the Princess is. This game starts as a branching narrative type of story, where a narrator talks and you decide whether to do what he tells you to or strike out on your own.
You're on a path in the woods. And at the end of that path is a cabin. And in the basement of that cabin is a princess. You're here to slay her. If you don't, it will be the end of the world.
The story is sort of a moral conundrum. I mean, it's called Slay the Princess, so you can kind of get the idea of what I'm getting at there. And the branching narrative lets you approach that in a bunch of different ways. But regardless of what you pick, the story eventually ends. Either your character dies or you kill a princess and some stuff happens.
Everything goes dark, and you die.
And that's when the entire story restarts.
You're on a path in the woods.
Once you've looped, some things are going to be the same and some things are going to be different. The things that stay the same, you're going to take in a new light. The things that are different will stand out more by being different. This game self-describes as both a horror game and a romance game, and depending on which and how much of those you experienced your first time through is going to change the context in which you see some events when you loop it through.
Still going to kill you, but now we could both enjoy a mutual romantic subtext to the murder.
The looping also prevents you from making the same decision multiple times in a row. So while in your first run-through, you're probably approaching it in a role-playing kind of manner, your subsequent run-throughs will be forced to be more exploratory. The story becomes less about what decisions you would make in a certain situation, and more about what decisions you could make in those situations. It's not just about one story, it's about the whole possibility space of stories that could happen. Now, after doing a number of loops through the story, you find out that this isn't just you, the player, going through it. You are role-playing a character that's in this larger story about discovering the options that could take place here. And the story of Slay the Princess is actually this meta story about exploring all the different things that could happen here. The crux of that meta story is that the character you're playing is trying to work through how he feels about some moral issues, what his values are in a bunch of situations, and what he wants to decide in this ultimate question everything is building towards. The game confronts you with all the choices you've made and asks you to come to some conclusion from all of that. So our character, who's exploring a story possibility space, is asked to find meaning within his exploration. And this stacked structure of the character in the game analyzing the decisions he made while playing that game caused me to pause, take a step back, and think more broadly about the things that this video game is saying at a larger level. The kind of meta-recursive nature of what it's doing with its story caused me to think about my real-life values. And of course, also made me think, wow, this is doing a lot of different things at once. Maybe it would be fun to categorize those or something. Anyways, when you finally finish a run of that game, the order in which you explored things and approached stuff is going to make the ending a little different. And there's enough options that nearly everyone's going to go through this in their own unique way. The game even brings attention to this by making a custom playlist for you on Spotify of the songs that played in the order that you went through the game. And it's a pretty cool way to visualize your unique experience of this game. It's just like so cool. It's like a cool conceptual idea. It's a fun story.
But look at this! Hands! Hands that don't have anything in them to stab you with!
Makes you think about your values and about art. It's beautiful and scary and it's an amazing game. So there you have it. That's 5 types of nonlinear narratives and the unique things that they can do. Now, I don't think this list is by any means exhaustive or the only way you can think about this. To be honest, the 5 types are more about having a nice way to structure a video and less something that I ontologically care about. But hopefully you got some value out of this. I especially thought doing all 5 types in this video was a fun idea. I don't know if you caught all of those, but it was fun coming up with the ideas here. I always end my videos with a recommendation you can check out. And for this video, it's going to be the short stories of Jorge Luis Borges, which are so crazy good. He does a ton of nonlinear stuff in these, comments a lot on the form of short form storytelling, has a ton of super inspiring ideas in these, some of which tie directly into old and future videos I'm planning on making, like simulation and simulacrum type stuff. And they still feel like super innovative short stories now, even though they were written 80 years ago. I would highly recommend checking it out if you have at all similar tastes in media as I do. Hi, I'm Jacob O'Neill. I'm the guy who runs this channel. I'm going to be at GDC, the Game Developers Conference, this upcoming March. If you're the type of person who goes to that kind of thing, feel free to let me know in comments if there's a decent number of people I would love to chat and meet up with. I honestly have no idea how much of my audience this would apply to, but you never know. Otherwise, if you happen to be there and see me around, say hi. I look like this. It's always fun to talk about this kind of stuff with people. I'm probably going to be at the cool talks, whatever that means, but around. I was originally hoping to do this at the end of next video, where I'm going to talk a little bit more about indie dev stuff, but as always, these videos take longer to make than I think they will, so here it is now. Thanks, as always, to the people on Patreon who help fund these videos. It's very nice to have a budget I feel like I can spend in the making of these videos, so always appreciated. I'm going to leave you with a fun thing I discovered, which is the theme song for Emiya in Fate Stay Night is in the same key as L's theme from Death Note. So that's kind of fun. Here's me playing it kind of poorly on a piano. I don't know. I think that's fun. Thanks for watching.